I'm Laura. I'm from a law firm in Leeds called Wrigley's, and we do charities and social enterprise law, but we also do lots of work in community-led housing as well. And my specialism is legal structures and governance and that kind of stuff, which is why I'm here today. What I'm going to talk to you about is, first of all, I'm going to just go through a little bit about what community-led housing is, because I think it's worth sort of taking a step back and just looking at that very briefly. I'm then going to look at what aims and priorities you've got with your groups and why that's so important. And then finally we're going to look at legal structures. I think legal structures, as Andrea said, needs to come right at the end of that process. And then I'm going to end with just 3 case studies to kind of bring it to life a little bit, because I think it can be quite dry, this kind of information, and I think the case studies really help to kind of illustrate what I'm talking about. So, in terms of what community-led housing is, the way it's usually, just so you know, I also sit on the board of the UK Co-housing Trust. So we do a lot of work in partnership with the National CLT network and with CDS cooperatives and with locality. So I've got lots of different hats on. But the way that the UK Co-housing Trust and National CLT network, when we're all working together, we kind of talk about community-led housing as encompassing these 4 categories. So there's co-housing, community land trusts, housing cooperatives, or collective self-build. Now, it's not as simple as there being 4 distinct categories. They all overlap and intermesh. You can have a CLT with some co-housing elements, and you can have a housing cooperative that's built along co-housing lines. So they're not sort of distinct categories, but they're quite useful. It's quite useful to understand what those 4 things are. Now, do you all understand what those things are? Can anyone tell me what co-housing is? What do you understand by co-housing?
Is it turning individual places with a community, shared communities, like kitchens and a place and gardens and that sort of thing? So it's actually your own individual flat or house, and then a community centre or place, and community gardens and some shared resources.
Yeah, does everyone agree with that? That's how you understand it? That's pretty much spot on how the co-housing network describes it. So it's not a legal structure really, co-housing. We talk about it as a way of living, so you have your own private environment but with some shared facilities. That might be a common house, could be shared allotments, gardens and so on. What about community land trusts? I'm hoping that Brighton and Hove CLT representatives might be able to tell me what CLT is.
All CLT work. Maybe only we know. Come on, Peter.
Peter must know what CLT is.
It's a way of holding land in trust for the community to steward it in perpetuity.
I really like the word stewardship, which I think you guys were the first group that I know that came up with, Brighton and Hove CLT put stewardship into their objects, and I really like that, and I tend to do that a lot now because I think that's a really good way of describing this idea of holding land and assets for the benefit of the community in the long term. Housing cooperatives kind of need no introduction because we've heard quite a bit about them already, but it's this idea that you don't necessarily live communally, but you certainly own a property communally and traditionally would pay rent into that co-op, but you don't own the house in your own individual right. And then collective self-build is a bit of an odd one in there, in that basically just refers to the fact that a group of people might come together and build their own properties. And that could be a co-housing group coming together, or it could be a community land trust who want to do some collective self-build as part of it. It's good grounding that we all are on the same page with what we're talking about. Helps. Now, in terms of getting started, I think I agree so much, 100% with what Andrea says. I get new groups coming to us, probably 3 or 4 a week at the moment, and some groups come and say, we want to be a KIC, we want to be a community benefit society, we want to be this, that. I always say, just take a step back and first of all ask yourself some key questions about what you're trying to achieve with your group, and almost forget legal structures, forget what type of community-led housing group you are. Work out what you actually want to get out of it personally and what your group wants to get out of it collectively. Now, the 3 questions which I will work through with you are, first of all, who will benefit? Another way of putting that would be who's going to live there. Secondly, it's where the funding is going to come from. And then thirdly, it's going to be how the property is going to be owned, who's going to own the property, how's it going to be held. And we'll work through all 3 questions in a bit more detail. What I would suggest is that while I'm going through these 3 questions and sort of fleshing out the questions you might ask, you might want to make some notes about where your group is at. And hopefully then when I talk about the actual legal structures, you've got a bit of a framework then which will guide your group as to which structure you might want to be. I suspect you're not going to make the decision this afternoon. You're going to have to go away and talk to your rest of your group about it, but I thought it might be quite a useful, fairly practical exercise. And that's why I think it could be quite helpful to be interactive. So if you've got anything to contribute while we're going through these questions, please do shout out. This is actually how we divide the team up at Wrigley's as well. So it's people, pounds and property. And I quite like alliteration, that's why I've chosen those 3 words. So I tend to be on the people side, working with groups and governance structures. Pounds is looking at the finances and how that works. I do a bit of that as well. And then property is sort of buying a site, developing a site, getting planning permission, moving in, and so on. So we have a big team at Wrigley's, and that's how we work ourselves within that. So now the first question, arguably, I think is probably the most important, particularly at the early stages, and that is asking yourself who will benefit from this organisation. So who's going to live in the properties that you build? Is it going to be, that first question, is it going to be the members or the wider community? Is the question really about who the members of your organisation are? Now, are your members going to just be the people who live in the homes, or are they going to be members drawn from the wider community? That links to this question about aims and priorities really, because are you setting something up because you believe that your local area needs more affordable housing or needs housing for people with disabilities or for old people, and it's sort of an altruistic thing that you're doing for the benefit of the community? Or are you setting something up because you want to live in a community? It's what you might call an intentional community. You want to set up your own neighbourhood where you know your neighbours, you control who lives there, you control who moves in and out. And they're 2 very different concepts. One is very outward looking. You're looking at benefits of the community as a whole, and then the other one is much more, I hesitate to say inward looking, but it's much more looking at something that's for the benefit of yourself and the neighbours that you're choosing to do this with.
I was just thinking of, having people that want to build their own houses and having a wider aim, like, a Montreal or something, they have people walking, and lots of the other communities, Brazier's part that we've just been camping on, they have people coming to learn things or beekeeping or whatever, they have an outer aim as well as an inner aim.
Absolutely, and I think that's really important because almost all co-housing communities I know of, co-housing communities, which tend to be these slightly more inward-looking groups, have that outward face as well. So Lilac in Leeds is a cooperative at its heart, actually, it's a mutual cooperative. They do an awful lot of outreach work, but ultimately they're a resident-owned structure. They can control who moves in and who moves into that community. So it's very much them keeping control over that space, even though they do that outward-facing work as well. So I think the question of control is quite important over in that one. And is there any more questions about that one?
Sorry, just going back quickly. When you said co-ops, you just said that as an individual property where a lot of people are living in it. Can't that cooperative model apply even if there's 4 or 5 houses? Or,
yes.
Yes. It's not just one.
Yeah. It's I suppose the key thing there is common ownership.
Yeah.
So I think in terms of that question about control as well, there's a few more things that you might want to ask yourself about that control. So if you're for the benefit of the community, do you need are there external stakeholders who are going to want to have a say over what you're doing? So I've worked with quite a few CLTs recently where the local council has either set the CLT up or has given them quite a lot of money, and they actually want to have a say over how the organisation is run. So we've had to build into the constitution council representation on the board, and that really takes away quite a lot of control from the people who are then going to be living in the houses. For good or bad, they've had big benefits because the council's been involved, and it means they've been able to get land very easily because the council owns the land and so on and so forth. But it is quite that question of sort of external stakeholder representation can be quite a thorny one. Housing associations are another stakeholder that you might need to consider. If you're doing partnership working, the housing association or the developer even might want some sort of input into your governance structure, and that would affect what legal structure you might end up being. So it's a question of looking at, I suppose, who's involved in your organisation and what they all want out of it. So it's your first big decision really. And we summarise this. I've brought some booklets along with me. In fact, I'll just grab one because I'll show you what they look like. We have a guide to legal structures for community-led housing, and I've brought along a few copies, but if there's not enough, I can email a copy out to you as well. And the way we revamped this last year because we had all these debates with different community-led housing groups about what structure they should be. And we rewrote it to make it much more focused on what your aims and priorities are as opposed to what your legal structure is. And we summarise it really as whether you should be resident owned or community owned, which mirrors really nicely what Andrew was talking about individual ownership or community ownership. And I think that sort of sums up a big question. So resident owned is where the members are the only people who live there. It's what we call, or I would call, closed membership. Housing cooperatives tend to be resident owned, and a lot of co-housing communities are also resident owned. In contrast, community owned, CLTs have to be community owned because of the legal definition of a CLT requires you to have an open membership open to the wider community. So it means it's controlled by the people who live or work or who want to live or work in your local area. Are there any questions about this sort of people question? Peter?
Just from what you just said about the people from the local community, I think you said, and there's some, I mean, I've heard a bit of discussion about to what extent a community might be differently defined other than by geographical location. So obviously some groups are like that, so there are older people's groups or something that are defined in different ways, but that kind of applies to my co-op as well, that we're kind of interested in becoming a CLT, but the community bit of that for us would be kind of related to shared values or a shared project, shared vision, more than a strictly defined geographical locality.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point because I've had that debate with my own group about whether you can have a community of interest as opposed to a geographical community. The definition of a CLT does talk about people living and working in a local area, which kind of focuses you very much on a geography as opposed to an interest.
Yeah, it's definitely a kind of assumption in various bits of the legislation and the kind of definitions of things, isn't it? But you could imagine that local was defined a bit larger in order to kind of then take a slice the other way across it.
Absolutely. I mean, and what's local? You know, like we've set up CLTs for tiny villages and we've set them up for counties. So then you kind of think, well, could you not have one for the whole country that is for a specific interest? So.
So can I ask, if we had a scheme that was a bunch of groups together, so a couple of co-housing communities and maybe a couple of housing co-ops and a bit of self-build on a big plot of land, and they were all their own entities, co-ops and co-housing, whatever, and were resident, basically resident members, could you put them in a CLT structure underneath so that the land was owned by the CLT with those groups sat on top of it, as it were, and that CLT would be the community of people in that area, or would it have to be open to people beyond the boundary of that bit of land?
My short answer would be yes, I think that works. And so we are doing some work at the moment with a CLT, well not a CLT, but they're going to become a CLT in Yorkshire, where the plan is that they're going to actually develop a whole load of different communities across the county that they work in, and they'll own the freehold, and then sat on top of what they own will be these co-housing communities or housing cooperatives, so that you've got the CLT looking after the land, the stewards of the land in the long term, but the actual communities themselves, the people who live there, have that kind of control over who can move in and out.
Okay.
It's obviously a bit more complicated when you do that, but
Yeah, and presumably complicated then if something happens, if you wanted to do something to the land, who has the power to, there'll be some sort of agreement between the CLT and that community for the life of the community? Or
yeah, it'd probably be the lease. You have it written as the lease. So,
okay.
yeah.
Thank you.
It's okay. So I'll move on to funding, if that's okay. So this is a question really of looking at where your funding is going to come from. So you guys here at NUB have already said if this, your group will have some equity to put in. Other groups who want to develop purely affordable housing have almost no equity to put in at all and are going to be much more reliant on grant funding and bank loans and so on. Now the reason some of these are more important than others when thinking about your legal structure, the reason why grants are important is that some grant funders are going to look for certain things within your legal structure. I'm going to talk about some of those things shortly. One of the key ones is an asset lock, which is basically an asset lock in your constitution limits what you can do with your assets. So it means that you can't just divide what that organisation owns and split it between the members and then run off to Mexico. You have to have some sort of wider purpose, community purpose, and that's sort of locked into what your organisation structure is. In particular, I would mention that generally speaking, community housing fund money, which is Brighton and Hove have got, it's up to at the moment it's up to individual local authorities how that's been spent. But most local authorities I know require an organisation to have an asset lock before they can give you. I don't know whether that's the case in Brighton. The community housing fund is a 5-year funding programme. We're only in the first year at the moment. They're about to announce any minute now what happens over the next 4 years. We're still waiting on them to announce it. So it depends on what they say with that, but I would be very surprised if they will just give it to anybody. I suspect one of the limitations will be that you have to be an asset locked organisation.
What does that mean? Sorry, what does that mean in practice then? What are they trying to achieve by getting you to do that?
Can I come on to that when we talk about that? Because I think it's quite an important one which really affects what you're going to be.
Could I sort of jump back a bit and just, because my brain's a bit slow, but I was thinking, say the land was owned by the Community Land Trust, but the real owner was the council, so basically the council was short of money, so they decided to sell the land and, sort of the Community Land Trust. So could that happen?
So what's quite common is that a council might own a site that they don't want anymore.
Yeah.
They would then grant a CLT a long lease of that land, and then the CLT would build some houses and then either sell off some houses or hold them and rent them out to people in need. So the council remains a freeholder. It's quite rare that a council would transfer the freehold. It does happen, but it is pretty rare. So the council, but because the lease between the council and the CLT would have lots of rights in there for both parties, and the council couldn't just kick the CLT off the land at will. Like, there have to be
And so locally, the only arrangement we have where the council lease to a whatever organisation, whether a CLT or a co-op, if they release it at what they consider to be below market value, they expect that entity to deliver housing for people on the home move register, on the housing register, no one else. But if you lease it at full market value and they're just renting it to you in effect at a market value lease, then you can do what you like with it. It's all about whether you're getting land subsidised or not subsidised by the council, or how they see it that way.
That's a debate that we have a lot with groups, how the council will treat them in terms of whether they require you to house people off the waiting list or not. That's definitely a thorny question in lots of local authorities. So the next question is, in terms of funding, is whether or not you're hoping to raise money from the community. Now, you might have come across this concept of community shares or community bonds. Certain organisational forms let you go out to the public and sell shares or offer bonds to the public. When you see an advert on television saying the value of these shares may rise or fall, and you get the whole garbled small talk at the end of an advert, that's all to comply with a horrible bit of legislation called FSMA, Financial Services and Markets Act. If you're a company, the way in which you comply with FSMA is really onerous. You have to have at least £50,000 and you have to have a prospectus that's approved by somebody who's authorised by the Financial Conduct Authority. If you're a community benefit society, you don't have to comply with those requirements because the type of share you offer is a different type of share. It's quite complicated, but the short summary of it is that it means that if you're a certain type of structure, particularly community benefit society, or a co-op actually, you can go out to the public and raise finance from members of the public by selling shares. And an awful lot of CLTs in particular do this partly because it's a really good way of engaging a local community in what you're doing. So if you need to get community support for building 20 houses on a bit of greenbelt land, then if you're going out to the public and saying, well, you can own a part of this, and it means that through your ownership, you can come to our general meetings and vote on it and have a say over what that property looks like, who lives there, what the building materials are. It can be a really fantastic way, really, of kind of getting that wider engagement from the people around you.
What's the difference between a share and a bond?
So a share is an equity stake. So you own a share in the organisation, which gives you a right to go to the general meeting and vote as a member. A bond is just a form of loan. So a bond would usually be a fixed term. So it might be for 1 year or 3 years or 5 years. And it doesn't give you that right, that democratic right to go and be represented at a meeting. So, and there's different reasons for choosing shares or bonds. So we have a co-housing group in Leeds at the moment, which just did a community bond offer, and they raised £600,000 from people in the local area. And they chose bonds because they're setting it up as a co-housing scheme, and they didn't want outsiders having a vote over their organisation. They wanted to keep the voting to the people who are going to live there.
So the same as loan stock?
Very similar, yeah.
So could you use that, for example, if you've got equity but you can't release it to do the build? So you wouldn't be able to release it until the build's done and you sell your house and you move in. Could you use it as that kind of bridging thing?
Not quite. I think I know what you're saying. You still need the cash you still need that cash to buy the shares.
Yeah.
So that question of timing and how you release the equity from the property you already own and so on is a difficult one. It often ends up being that you have to just sell your house and rent until you are ready to move into the new scheme.
Sorry, can you just repeat, because I'm a bit confused about that. Crowdfund or issuing community shares and bonds is to raise money, but isn't that to raise money for capital? To help buy land and build it?
Yes.
So, I'm saying that I'm a bit confused about what your question was.
I suppose I was trying to say a lot of people with equity, your issue is you have equity, you might have equity but you haven't got it in your hand to buy the land or build the house, so I was wondering if you could use that scheme to be that bridge.
Bridging.
Yeah. It's already tied up.
Yeah,
it's tied up somewhere else.
Yeah. And sorry, just to follow on. The community shares and bonds, I've kind of got a general idea, but how different is that from, in terms of the loan stock, crowdfunding and like funding, so all that sort of stuff? Is that just another form of? They're not community shares necessarily.
No, crowdfunding is
like basically people putting money in and hoping for some sort of return.
Crowdfunding is a generic term which covers any sort of raising finance from the wider population, and it's often used to mean donations. So I've got friends who crowdfund for various things, writing books or making films, and in return for your small investment of £10 or £50, you might get a copy of their book or a copy of their film at the end, but that's it. You don't get shares or...
So could you not crowdfund and in exchange for the money you basically get given, offer them a share in the organisation?
Yeah, and that's effectively
what... Just an altruistic kind of, I've got a share in this and I support it rather than...
That's effectively what you're doing with a community share offer. You're crowdfunding, but in return for the money you put in, you're getting your share certificate, and you can get the money back at the end. But it's still any form of crowdfunding like that, where you're selling shares in an organisation or even bonds in an organisation. You could fall foul of this complicated legislation.
That's what I'm thinking about,
yeah. So that's when you have to look at what legal structure you're going to be and tailor that to.
So not to allow you to do that, because that's what.
Yeah.
Which Brighton and Hove Community Land Trust can do.
Which you can, yeah.
Because you're a community benefit, so.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and we have it. Laura wrote into our constitution that we could use community shares.
So, just to clarify that community benefits societies and mutual co-ops can avoid registering with the FSA.
You could avoid. Well, you're registered with the FCA, but you could do a community share offer. It's difficult with co-ops. Is a difficult one, and you two know a lot more about co-ops than I do. But because co-ops tend to fully mutual co-ops, your members, this is going perhaps beyond what we need to do in this session, but your members are the people who benefit from the co-op's activities. So by selling shares to external people, you could lose your mutual status. So there'd be a risk there. It's whether you could have investor only members in some co-ops, but then you're not fully mutual anymore. So.
But you could issue bonds.
You could potentially issue bonds, yeah.
So how would people generally get that back? So if you raised 100 grand from the community, would they expect like an annual like interest payment, or is it just fixed term, or I mean, how do people normally?
So if I give you an example of another organisation in Leeds which operates very similar to Brighton and Hove, it's an umbrella CLT that looks after lots of different housing organisations across Yorkshire. They did a community share offer, raised £360,000. Most people put in £100 or £200, and I think they have a rule when you invested that you couldn't get your money out for 3 years. They say that they'll pay interest if they can, and the interest is the interest on shares. It's a bit like in normal parlance we'd call it dividends on shares, but you're not allowed to call it dividends on shares in this type of share. And it's so that's why I own some shares in them. I own 100 quid or something in them. And when I want my money back, I would just have to write to them. The directors retain control. The directors have the right to say no. So when I want my money back, the directors could say we can't do it at the moment because we've not got the cash flow. We need that money to build the house we're going to build. But at some point, what we would do is write into the rules something that's usually after about 3 years, the society has to just pay it you out. They've just got that right to suspend for a while.
So most people do it because they want some kind of a role within that organisation rather than they're seeing it as a big money-making thing. It's
definitely not a big money-making thing. Yeah.
So is this the model? I mean, in Brighton, there's quite a few community-owned pubs.
Yeah.
So it will be this will be the model that they're using
Exactly.
to buy those pubs.
Exactly, and I think there's a whole organisation called the Community Shares Unit, and we could do a whole session on community shares, but it's this, investors tend to be people who are driven by a combination of altruism, wanting to support a local community project, and then wanting some level of financial return. So they don't want to just make a donation, they want to get the money back at the end.
I was going to say, what's the best way of going about looking for investors, I guess is the right word?
So an awful lot of media support is the way that the best ones I've seen have been in the newspaper every week for a year before the share offer.
Doc's going to do a session on it, so
Perfect.
Brilliant.
later.
Great. So let's move on. Should we move on to the last three things are the last three things on this list are going to be, they're less important in terms of drivers of your legal structure. I think those top two are the key ones really. Individuals, so that might be where I'm going to move into a co-housing scheme and I've got £200,000 of equity. I wish I had £200,000 of equity that I could bring to this co-housing scheme, and what I could do is set up a legal structure and then lend my money to that legal structure to buy into it, and you'd have a loan agreement between me and that legal structure. So that's what I mean there by individual loans, and we see that a lot with housing co-ops. So you might get a group of people who come together, want to buy a house together as a cooperative, and they all pool their money in, and we would put in place a loan agreement between the individuals and that co-op. And then loans include obviously standard bank loans, but also specialist lenders. Homes England, it's the new name for the HCA. Some local authorities offer loans for this kind of work. And then finally, in-kind support is something really not to underestimate the value of. So the organisations I've seen who have been able to develop community-led housing most quickly have had an awful lot of in-kind support. That might be cheap or free land. It could be low cost or free professional fees, architects, lawyers, accountants. It could also be things like construction materials. So an organisation I know of built houses made of, it's called mod cell, which is straw bales but in panels, and it was the first time they'd been used in the UK, so they got them at a bargain basement price, which I think it would be prohibitively expensive if you tried to do it at full price. So that's the questions really you have to ask yourself about funding. And then moving on to the property.
So I'll go back to the last chapter. I think we're kind of envisaging doing most of those things, including like quite a lot of in-kind donation. But You mentioned Homes England HCA funding, but not in any great depth. So one of the things we want to do is try and take advantage of whatever grant funding, not necessarily out of this community housing fund pot, but other pots as well. So, and I understand a CBS kind of could qualify as for that grant, but could not just Homes England, but local authorities, some regional LEPs and whatever you call them. Can other organisations qualify for that as well? Organisational structures, but
yeah. So when we come on to talk about asset loss and charitable status, I'll talk a bit about grant funding again there, because I think that's quite key. What I would say is Homes England these days, there's very little grant funding available, small loans, and loans. I know of situations where they've given loans to resident-owned co-housing groups, which would be very unlikely to qualify for grants, but they may well qualify for a loan.
Yeah, so it's got to take back of it. Yeah. And then, sorry, are you going to talk about grant-making trusts as well?
Yeah, same principles apply really. So I will come on to that.
Okay, all right.
Can I just quick question? Are there loans cheaper than commercial, like Ecology Building Society mortgages?
Yes.
They are.
Homes England loans.
Yeah.
Yeah, although the term they can be pretty onerous.
Okay.
Yeah, sort of it's
not obvious to choose them.
No, they want the pound of flesh in return for the cheap rates.
Good to know.
Yeah. Okay, and then so the third question, or the third set of questions to ask yourself about your group is how the property is going to be owned. So what I've called personal versus common ownership is what Andrew described as individual versus common ownership, I think, so, or community ownership. So in personal property ownership, I would describe that as where an individual owns either a freehold or a long leasehold of their own individual space, and then your community-led housing organisation might own the freehold and grant you a long lease, and they're very likely to keep ownership of all the common areas. And that'll become much more clearer when we talk about the case studies. We'll come on to the case studies at the end. But Andrew's first case study was basically that, where you own your own private house, and when you move out, you can sell that house and realise the capital and take your money and go and buy another one somewhere else. In contrast, common ownership would be much more the model where the organisation itself owns the property, or even properties, and you might pay rent to live there. When you move out, you usually would get nothing. You just move out and gone. You're not built up any equity yourself. There is an exception to that where, there's the loan stock structure, which Andrew described, where you put loan stock into the organisation. You don't have your name on any title deed. You can't point to a particular room and say, I own that, because it's all owned collectively. But you do have some finance in the organisation which you can take with you when you go. And again, when I come to the case studies, I'll describe a really interesting form of that. Another question would be about whether the legal structure is going to retain a long-term interest in the property. So, this might be, particularly where you're going to build, say, affordable housing, shared ownership or shared equity, or housing for affordable or social rent. Chances are the legal structure will own those properties or own parts of the properties in the long term. And again, that can just it's worth thinking through that at an early stage to work out whether your legal structure works with that kind of model. I think a more important question with that is whether your financial model works with that. I've got lots of groups who want to do affordable housing, who, when it including my own actually, where when it's come to looking at the financial model, we just don't know how we're going to be able to afford to provide affordable and social rent alongside everything else. So, those are the three sets of questions. I'm now proposing to move on to actually working out what legal structure you want to be. Hope that's okay. If you've got any other questions, shout now. You can always come back to it at the end. Go for it, Francis.
I'm not clear about the co-housing. So, okay, so you own rooms at freehold or on lease. And what about the common areas? Who are they owned by? Or?
So in traditional, in co-housing as it's commonly set up, co-housing isn't a legal structure, it's just a way of living. But a lot of the co-housing schemes that are set up in the UK, in England at the moment, you'll have a co-housing company or co-housing organisation which owns the freehold of the whole site, and owns the common areas, and they grant long leases to individuals. In some cases they might sell individuals the freehold of their individual properties. So you end up with this slightly hybrid model where you own your own property, but you're also a member of a company which owns all the common areas.
Are short leases different from long leases?
Yes, in terms of the rights you've got. You could... Is the question, what are you thinking about?
Well, I suppose it relates to anxieties about the right to buy and things like that.
Yeah. Right to buy, I mean, is again, that's a whole other topic, which I think, unless it's a council property or unless you're a housing association, you don't have to worry too much about it. But there are other issues, such as enfranchisement's probably a bigger risk.
Yeah, I don't know the difference between enfranchisement and right to buy.
Enfranchisement, in short, is the right of, when you've got a long lease, you can exercise a right to buy your freehold, and it could really break up a community. So,
After how long? You have to been in it for a certain amount of time.
I don't think you do.
Immediately,
Oh,
isn't
really?
it?
Immediately?
Yeah, it's quite. I mean, I've never seen it happen, but it's a risk that we tell groups to be aware of. A massive caveat to all this actually is that the government is currently reviewing leaseholds, and it seems quite likely that they're going to ban any new long leaseholds from being issued, from being granted, which it'll have a huge impact on the community-led housing sector. So the National CLT Network and the Housing Network are doing loads of campaigning work about it. So if you fancy going on their website and writing to your MP, it's not with my Wrigley's hat on, it's with my other hats on, but
Why would they do that then? What's the purpose of stopping long leases?
Because have you seen all this stuff in the paper in the last couple of years where big developers grant a long lease on a housing estate, and they've written into the long lease a ramping up mechanism for the service charge?
Yes, and it gets doubled and tripled.
Yeah, with the
Why
ground
can't
rent.
they tackle that without tackling long leases? Because surely a long lease is protective for the tenant, isn't it? Or
Yeah.
the owner.
Yeah, exactly. And there's lots of reasons, particularly in community-led housing, why you would use a long lease, because it's much easier to put in rules about how you live in that community with a leasehold structure than a freehold. So, but it's what we're hoping is that the government would agree to. Again, this is not my Wrigley's hat on at all. I have to be very careful about official lines. But we're hoping that the government would agree to an official definition of community-led housing, and then would exempt community-led housing from any new rules they bring in. But it's all up in the air. No one knows. Still consulting. Sorry, I think you've been waiting for a while.
Yeah, that's all right. So personal v common ownership. Is there any way of perhaps having a hybrid of that, in the sense that people come with vastly different equities? So what advice would you give to that?
Yeah, you definitely could. I think you. Perhaps I can talk to you later about it if that's okay. It's quite specific. You could, like Andrew was saying earlier on, which I think is really important, is take the basic principles from what I'm saying and then almost mould it to your own community. So you could have a structure where you've got some bits which are personally owned. In fact, go on. I'll give you an example of my own personal CLT I'm involved in. We're talking about developing X number of houses, some of which will be for personal ownership. So we'll grant long leases to individuals who can afford to buy in. And then we'll also, the idea is that the sale of those properties will cross-subsidise the development of more affordable housing, which will be common ownership, they'll be for rent. So the CLT will own those affordable properties and charge rent to people who live there.
Because that's something we've talked about, so it's legally possible.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Brilliant.
Almost anything's legally possible if you.
So if you've got shared ownership of the freehold for the site and of the shared spaces, and say somebody comes with equity and they completely can fund their self-build of 200 grand or whatever, they only then have a leasehold on that property, or would you? So if you build your own house, the co-op or whatever, the structure owns the land as a freehold. Do you not have a freehold on your house? That's something I'm not very.
That would be
clear on.
it would be up to you and the organisation
Right,
to
okay.
work out. So
Right.
there's different ways of doing it. I'll move on to the next section because hopefully this will help you work through some of these specific questions. So in terms of once you've gone through and you've got answers to all these questions and you've worked out what your vision and values and objectives are, I would say only then do you start looking at what legal structures should be. So again, in my own CLT, what we did was spent it goes back to what Phil said earlier about your value statement. We spent evenings and evenings and evenings going around the room and talking about what our values were, and we wrote them all down. And it was a brilliant exercise because we worked out that we were all on the same page with it. We all wanted the same thing: sustainable, ethically minded community to live in where people like doing the same thing. We only had one lawnmower between 30 people and so on. So we did all this, and then we started talking about legal structures. And when it actually comes to choosing your legal structures, I would say there are 3 steps. So the first one is to choose the basic structure. Then you look at the optional wrapper, which you put around the legal structure, and then you look at customising your own constitution. Now, I've only put in 3 basic structures here. I've put in companies limited by guarantee, community benefit societies and cooperative societies, and that's because those three types of basic organisation are the only real 3 types of organisation you're going to consider when you're looking at legal structures for community-led housing. You could not have a legal structure at all. You could be unincorporated. So that would mean me and a group of mates coming together to buy a property or a group of properties, and we don't have a company or a society or anything. We just put our own individual names on the title deeds. That would be fine. And actually, the co-housing group I'm looking at being involved in at the moment, we might end up doing that with that one because it's just me and a group of mates. It doesn't need to have this formal legal structure. There are lots of advantages to having a formal legal structure. Not least, it gives you the benefit of that entity is its own legal person. So in law, that company or society is a legal person. So the name of the company or society goes on the title deeds and signs the contracts with the developers and so on. So administratively, it's a lot easier, so that if I move in with my mates into this co-housing scheme and then move out again in 3 years' time, if we're doing it in our individual names, we're unincorporated, we'd have to change around the property documents and the names and so on. If we did it in the company's name, it's future-proofed. You also have the benefit of a limited liability, so if it all went wrong, you've got some protection there because you're doing things through the name of the company or the society rather than individually. The optional wrappers that I'll talk about, asset locks and charitable status in particular, comes back to this question about grant funding and so on. So, in terms of your basic structure, these are the 3 options I outlined. So companies limited by guarantee, the advantage really, main advantage is that they're super flexible. They're very familiar, funders understand what they are, you can customise them very easily. They are governed by company law, which the English courts are very familiar with dealing with company law if and when things go wrong. The big drawback with them is that they're a guarantee company, so there's no share capital, so you can't sell shares in a company limited by guarantee. We wouldn't usually use a company limited by shares for community-led housing. So when people talk about limited companies, they usually mean a share company, and that tends to be used for profit-making organisations where you want to be able to take a dividend out and you want to make money out of being a shareholder of that organisation. Obviously, I'm perhaps getting too complicated now, but if you're a share company, you can sell shares in your organisation, but then you get caught by FSMA, that bit of legislation I was talking about where you need to have £50,000 capital and comply with those prospectus requirements. It was a bit of a non-starter really. I have once come across a community-led housing organisation that was set up as a share company, and they came to us because they wanted to switch because it wasn't working. These other 2 options, community benefit societies and cooperative societies, it's an entirely different regime from company law. So they've been around since the 1850s in various forms. They used to be known as industrial and provident societies, and they are, you don't register with Companies House, you register with the Financial Conduct Authority, but it's not the Financial Conduct Authority that looks at banking and so on. It's a team of about 6 people in a mutuals register. It's a bit of an odd department really within the FCA. The big advantage of being a society over a company is that you can raise community shares, which we've talked about quite a lot. And then I think one of the most important things when you're looking at whether you should be, which of these three organisations you should be, comes back to this question about who your people are, who your members are. So if you're a resident-owned community, then your option's really a cooperative society or a company. If you're a community-owned organisation, then your options are community benefit society or company. So a company can be either resident or community-owned, but if you're the two types of society, one's community-owned, one's resident-owned. And it's because in law, in society law, a community benefit society exists for the benefit of the wider community, whereas a cooperative exists for the benefit of its members. Okay, it was a bit of a whistle-stop tour through basic legal structures, but...
So can I just ask that first one? I was just trying to think of a community that is a community that all got equity already. They don't need to raise any money outside. They could use that because they know they've got their stock of money. They've still got the logistics of how to sell it and pool it in order to get into their common. That's really the only kind of groups I can imagine using that.
But they could still get a bank loan. She could still get a loan.
Oh, of course. So
So-
you could still get a mortgage or a bank loan. Fine.
Yeah,
Of course
development
you
loan,
can.
whatever. So,
So when you say cannot raise equity, you mean by the issuance of shares and
Yes.
bonds?
Yeah. So
Yeah.
only by its
So
yeah, fair enough.
that word equity
They
is
can raise a loan. They can get a loan. Of
Yeah.
course they can.
Yeah.
I see. Sorry. Go on.
So if you're a group like ours, so you've got a mixture of a little bit of capital but not equity, renting and equity, I'm feeling like it draws you towards a resident-owned cooperative because the top one wouldn't work so well when you've got such a broad mix of what's being brought in. Right.
I think if you're, I think work out whether you're resident owned or community owned first of all. If you're going to be resident owned, then look at whether you should be a company or a cooperative. And there's not, they are very different types of organisation, but there's not a magic answer really.
Yeah.
I think it's worth just working out. Company is much more flexible, and I'll talk about some of the customisation that you can put in a company's articles in terms of voting rights and so on.
Yeah.
In a cooperative, the general principle is that each member has one vote.
Yeah. I mean, we've got a kind of vision statement and all of that. We've been working on that, so we've got a really clear idea of what we want to achieve.
Talked about, we're really not sure what way we're going to go, but you talked about mortgages. How is that process, in your experience, different with co-housing rather than, say, if I just went out for myself?
That's
Go on. Yeah, I mean, we can do a session with you on that. I mean, we have talked about that in our previous sessions. We've got on our website there's a finance workshop, financial planning workshop, where we talk about some of the stuff from mortgages and the difference between applying as an individual and applying as an organisation. So all of these assume that you're applying as pretty much as an organisation.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think in terms of individual mortgages, there are some lenders, there's a much smaller number of lenders who will lend to an individual buying into a co-housing community. So, because they're quirky, because if you're buying into X co-housing community and there's funny things in the lease about the fact that when you sell your house, you have to have your buyer approved by the community. Mainstream banks don't understand that or don't like it. So there's a handful of lenders which we work with closely who know the sector and understand it and are comfortable with it now. But I suggest that sounds like a good session to go to.
Sure. Thank you.
So once you've got the basic legal structure, we've just moved on too fast. You then have to look at what your wrapper, and I use this phrase wrapper because it's the best word I've ever managed to come up with to describe it. But it's things that sit on top of that basic structure. And the three key ones are whether you've got a non-charitable asset lock, whether you've got charitable status, which is effectively another type of asset lock, or whether you should be a community land trust. So an asset lock, I've touched on this before, but essentially it's just something which you build into your constitution which limits what you can do with your assets. So typically it would be wording which says that you can't divide up the assets of the organisation between the members. You can only use those assets for the benefit of the community, or by giving them to another charity, or by giving them to another asset locked organisation. So in practice it means that if you have a a community-led housing organisation which owns 30 houses and a farm in Devon, and then the community all disbands and collapses, and the organisation owns everything, when you dissolve that company, you couldn't just divide up the asset, all those houses and the value of the land and all the rest of it between yourselves. It'd have to go to this wider, have to go for some wider community benefit, depending on what the wording of your asset lock was. Does that make sense? Is that clear? Yeah. It might be required for grant funding, and this is what we kept going back to earlier. Homes England, I think, if they were going to make you a grant, would probably want some form of asset lock, if not charitable status, which is sort of a stronger asset lock. Charitable grant-making trusts might want, well, they're very likely to want some form of asset lock. They might want charitable status. I do know of some that will give non-charitable organisations grants, provided they've got an asset lock in there, but they're rarer. And you would only really look at having an asset lock in a community-owned structure, because if you're a resident-owned structure, you're existing for the benefit of the people who live there. So if and when you decide to break up that community and sell, then you probably do want the ability to divide up the value of the property between yourselves and carry on with the rest of your life. Whereas in a community-owned structure, it's got that kind of outward-facing, we exist for the benefit of the community in the long term, so we want to make sure that whatever we do with our assets at the end goes to the community. Go on, John.
I've heard scare stories about cooperative societies selling up and dividing the assets between those members, which seems very unfair. If, say it's a rental co-op, people have been paying in rent for years, and then the final residents get the benefit.
Yeah, I agree. I've never got my head around that with housing co-ops, because you might have a group of people, particularly all those housing co-ops which were set up in the 70s, and the original members might have left, and you've got people who've been there for 2 years and they take the benefit. I've asked people who set up co-ops in the 70s that question, and have never got the right answer.
So can you create an asset lock for that kind of?
Not for a co-op. No, there's no. They've talked about introducing a statutory asset lock for a co-op, and you could have. I mean, you can have wording in your cooperative rules that said that you could put something in your rules that was like akin to an asset lock, but there's nothing to stop them being changed. Like the members who live there at the end could just vote and change it and divvy it up between themselves.
You could have a co-op that had a lease from the Community Land Trust, and the Community Land Trust owned the assets, wouldn't you? It would function just the same as a co-op, but the assets wouldn't be free to divide up between.
Yeah, that goes back to Andrea's idea of having a CLT which owns the base, a co-op sat on top of it. So if the co-op dissolves, it just goes back to the CLT, which I think is a good protection.
Can I just, on the back of that, if you did that, then CLT has to be a community of interest or a community of geography or whatever. So all those members, what's slightly worrying is haven't you got a conflict between a CLT that is, like, say, has 2,000 members and a co-op on top of it that's, say, 200 people living in that community. Could the CLT members somehow trump the co-op members and decide to change the housing and Peter, you put your hand up, you've got an answer
well,
there. You'd have the relationships governed by not just the governance structure, but also your contractual relationship. So but that could be the lease.
Okay.
So you'd have there's those three protections, I suppose: governance, property, and contract. And the property and contract relationship would probably govern to make sure that you couldn't just be trumped and kicked out.
Thank you.
Good. I'm sorry, Peter.
Yeah. So the other dimension of that is just, for instance, with Brighton and Hove CLT, it's a multi-stakeholder organisation. So you'd have a guaranteed vote for if a third of the votes in Brighton and Hove CLT are with residents. So that would also give a kind of weighted representation that would allow. I mean, obviously the lease terms would define it, but it would allow a general level of control of the whole organisation as well.
But I understand what Andrea is saying, because if only a third, and then you've got 2/3,
Yeah.
you've got large numbers of people
Yeah.
and small numbers of people.
But what you're saying is there'd be two levels of protection. That sort of gives you some protection. You've got a voice. The
Yeah.
200 residents would have a third of the voice in the CLT anyway. But you're saying you'd have something legal that said that the housing structure that sat on top of the TLC was protected against the CLT people just deciding to change their minds, get rid of the housing and turning it into a farm.
Yeah,
which you wouldn't want, obviously, if you were living in the housing.
It would be in your lease.
It would be in your lease.
I suppose, but the lease would only govern your land, so there'd be a risk that, say you had a CLT which owned 10 acres, it granted a co-op an acre of it, and then it decided on the acre next to it to build an abattoir.
Yeah.
That's a worst
You wouldn't
case
be able to
scenario.
control that.
You'll be able to control that, not
That's fine.
necessarily.
Yeah. Okay. That's fine. Thank you.
I'm a bit confused about when you say it's non-charitable asset lock. For grant funding purposes, I understand you should have charitable status, but you're saying if you have a non-charitable asset lock,
Yeah.
so you're not charitable. So how can you? I don't quite understand.
So that's a good link actually into. I said before that a non-charitable asset lock you can only really put that into a community-owned organisation, and the two options are a community interest company or a community benefit society, and in both cases it's statutory wording. So it's set out in statute, in legislation, wording which makes your organisation have that asset lock, and you can't change it. So in a community interest company, you start off with a company limited by shares or guarantee, and you have to include certain things in your articles which are prescribed in law, which limit what you can do with your assets.
So that makes you into a community interest.
And that makes you into a community interest company, yeah. And you also, with a community interest company, you also have to write a community interest statement every year. So you submit a community interest statement to the KIC regulator saying this is how we benefit the community. And similarly, a community benefit society can choose to have a non-charitable asset lock built into its rules. And if it wants that asset lock, it's some wording which is set out in a piece of law which you just slot into your rules.
So a CBS can have charitable status but with a non-charitable asset lock.
A CBS can be non-charitable, it can be non-charitable with an asset lock, or it can be charitable. There's three options. So this is why I say to go through those three stages of choosing your basic structure and then looking at what wrapper you want. So if you choose to be a CBS, you then say, well, do I need an asset lock? If you're going to have an asset lock, should it be a non-charitable asset lock, or can I qualify for charitable status? Which brings me on to the next slide, which is very helpful. So this is a big decision for lots of community-led housing groups, particularly CLTs. To be a charity, you have to meet two tests in law. Firstly, you have to have a charitable purpose, and secondly, you have to exist for the public benefit. Now, charitable purpose, the provision of housing is not a charitable purpose, which I find quite hard to believe, but that's the way it is, and it's always been. Charity's been around since the 1600s, and that's it's just fact of life. It's not. If you are providing housing in your organisation and you want to be a charity, that housing has to meet some other charitable need. And that might be financial hardship or poverty, could be disabilities, it could be old age. But you have to show that there's people who are in charitable need, who need the housing. And a lot of the time it's going to be financial hardship or poverty. I had a quick look at the estate agents as I was walking through Brighton, and I noticed a house on offer for £500,000 that was aimed at young families, which I just thought reminds me why I don't live in the southeast anymore.
Yeah.
But it's the way we would usually do it with housing organisations who are aiming to relieve poverty is you'd have to do a fairly careful analysis of what local incomes are and what local property prices are, both for buy and rent. And the rule of thumb is that you should have to spend no more than a third of your income on housing every month. If the local prices mean that you have to spend more than a third of your income every month, then there's a charitable need there. And that's a very rough way of looking at it. If your organisation can provide housing for less than that, then you're meeting that charitable need. So the £500,000 house in Brighton, I'm well educated and I've got a pretty good job. I couldn't afford that. So I feel like I'm a charitable beneficiary in Brighton.
It's about 15 times average income in Brighton. So, the first house I bought in '97 in Brighton was 5 times my income. The one I'm in now is 19 times my income. So I couldn't afford the house I'm in now, even though I've worked for years and moved up and all the rest of it. And that, they say, isn't it, is the measure of when housing's hit a crisis, when people couldn't afford the houses they're already in.
Yeah.
And that's when you know it's really pretty. And we get paid the same, of course. If you're in Leeds, Manchester, where I'm from, or Brighton, I work at the local authority, I get paid exactly the same, you know, as someone where you can pick up a house for 180 grand. So it's...
Yeah. Quite. So I think places like Brighton, Surrey, places where wages aren't particularly high, but properties are very high, the charitable need question is quite easy to satisfy. There are places where it is much harder. So there are places like Hove where actually property values are so low, and wages are the same as York. I mean, York's an interesting one because York's very expensive to live, but there's not much work there. There's lots of tourism, but that's very low paid. So there is a charitable need there. Whereas Hull, the property prices are really low as well. So actually, it's much harder to satisfy that charitable test.
So you said housing is not deemed to be a charitable purpose, but then you went on to say that if you're providing housing at a third of your income, that can be seen as a charitable.
Because alleviating poverty.
Yes, because alleviating
poverty.
The alleviation of poverty is the charitable purpose.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. So
Okay.
housing itself isn't the need, isn't the need.
So.
Yeah. And then the second test you have to pass is
unless you're doing meeting the needs of specialist groups.
Yeah.
Like you said,
like
the elderly or
disabilities or
right. So if it's housing
or
for
trannies,
specialist,
you know,
yes.
some other exclusive groups as well.
Housing for specialist groups is housing. So that's.
I think the starting point should be: are you meeting a charitable need with what your organisation's doing? So identify there's a charitable need in your community. And so a really interesting one I'm looking at the moment is an LGBT group for elderly people. And they've been experiencing an awful lot of discrimination in care homes, so they're looking at setting up a care home for LGBT people on the basis that they're experiencing problems and discrimination. We've not got it through the Charity Commission yet, so whether the Charity Commission accepts it is another question.
What would it actually have to be? The housing itself that is the charitable thing. One of the ideas we had was we all want to grow lots of food, like lots of people do. And maybe set up a community garden to allow other people from outside of we live to come in and benefit from it and reap the benefits of it. Would that pass?
Qualify. So so I think, like I said, if you work out what the need is, so by having a community garden and growing food, what need are you meeting?
Yeah. Well, for example, perhaps disadvantaged kids wouldn't learn practical skills, things like that. So
basically you have to prove that you just have to write that you're meeting that need. You have to create a proposal and convince the Charity Commission that you're good providers of meeting that need.
Or would they say, well, that's just the community garden, it's not your community?
That's to do with,
So what you do is when you're drafting your organisation's constitution, or your articles or your rules, you have to draft what your objects are, and then everything that you do has to fall within those objects. So your objects, if you're going to be a charity, your objects have to be charitable in nature. So an example would be we're going to relieve poverty and illness and financial hardship by the provision of housing. So the charitable purpose is relieving poverty, financial hardship and illness. By the provision of housing is just the activities you're doing to meet that need. So if you could say we're going to tackle unemployment and we're going to advance education by having a community garden, potentially that works.
Yeah.
I think what you then have to look at is everything else your organisation doing also doing that?
Yeah.
Or is that just a small part of it? If it's just a small part of it, it doesn't work. But if that's the main purpose of your organisation, then potentially. So then the second test is a really important one to bear in mind because you have to meet both tests. You can't just meet one of them. And the second test is that you have to exist for the public benefit. And this is where a lot of community-led housing groups will come a cropper. It means that resident-owned communities don't qualify. So the vast majority of co-housing groups don't qualify for charitable status. And the reason is that there's too much private benefit involved because when you move out, you can take your money with you. You're not a worthy beneficiary. So it's quite this question around charitable status is quite a complicated one. There are some examples where it's very obvious. So you're building very cheap housing for affordable rent in a very expensive part of the country where wages are very low, and that's all you're going to do, it's pretty obvious that you could probably be a charity. Whereas you're building housing in a cheap area of the country where wages are average and you're all going to be owner-occupiers, that's probably not charitable because there's too much private benefit there. So it really turns on the facts of what you're doing. And because of this public benefit point, it means that you have to be a community-owned structure. So, and you could be a company or you could be a community benefit society. So a company and a community benefit society, you've got 3 options. You've got the plain vanilla organisation, the very basic structure. You've got a non-charitable asset lock, or you've got the charitable asset lock. And then finally, I've just said, why would you? Why would you bother with charitable status? Now, the big driver is almost always tax. So if you're a trading organisation, you don't have to pay corporation tax on profits from charitable trading. In a community-led housing context, you don't usually pay SDLT, which is it could be a huge saving. There's also exemptions around VAT as well.
Does everyone understand SDLT?
So SDLT is the tax that you pay when you buy a property. So whether you're an individual or a company or a society, you pay SDLT when you purchase property. If you're a corporate entity like a company or a society, it's a whacking great charge. I think it's 15% I think at the moment. It changes all the time, but it can be tens of thousands of pounds that you pay up front, and it just goes. You have to just pay it to the government. And if you're a charity, you don't generally pay that.
It's what they call stamp duty. Or is it different? It's newly called something else, is it?
Yeah, well, it's stamp duty land tax. Yeah.
So what's it called now?
Stamp duty land tax, SDLT. Yeah.
So individual owners pay it when they buy a house as well, don't they?
Yes.
At a lower level.
Yeah.
So it's lower with charitable status.
Yeah, you don't usually pay it. You don't usually pay it with charitable status. There are some circumstances in which you might end up doing, but usually the general rule is that you don't.
And there's a current contentious issue for housing co-ops. So you've heard of the housing co-op in Oxford who've got stung for retrospective stamp duty, which wasn't paid because in Oxford, like Brighton, the prices are enormous. So for a 5-bedroom house, they've paid over 500 grand. And over 500 grand, you pay at a higher level. So they've been stung with a 60 grand bill that they weren't expecting when they bought their property. And I think the Co-ops UK are trying to get co-ops exempt from the corporation level stamp duty because it was intended to tackle Russian oligarchs buying property in the UK through a company. And quite rightly, though, you want those people paying some tax to the British government for the massive profits they make. But it wasn't intended to sting, people setting up housing co-ops to live affordably. Is that right?
Yeah,
pretty
yes.
much. I don't know how successful that campaign is being or how long it will take. But
No, and that one in Oxford is. I think there was an error in the way that HMRC have approached it. So I was quite hopeful that they might get away with that.
okay, fine. So co-ops could each co-op, because we've got co-ops, plenty of co-ops who are going to be over the 500 grand threshold in buying a property. One group of student co-ops, they're talking about paying 100 grand. That's the calculation for their stamp duty on basically a 1.5 million property, and that's a 15-bedded ex-nursing home. That's a lot of money. It could make it unviable, just the stamp duty alone. So if they were exempt, they'd instantly save 110 grand.
Yeah.
So you think they could argue that they should be exempt?
I think in that one in Oxford there was a specific circumstance.
Right.
That their specific circumstances I think meant that HMRC had calculated it wrongly. I can't remember the facts of it,
Okay.
but I looked at it. I had a chat with them in a pub somewhere and I looked at it for them and concluded that I thought they should be okay, but I don't know where they got to.
Okay, so we should find out.
Can I ask a really probably silly question? Is there a difference between if you buy a property or buy land?
In SDLT terms, there is,
Yeah.
but I'm afraid I couldn't tell you what that difference is. It's one of those taxes which changes all the time and it's quite complex. If you Google SDLT calculator, HMRC have this very nifty calculator where you can put in what you're buying and they'll tell you what the price, what it will cost. Yeah, it is.
It's a bit of political football as well, isn't it? It tends to get changed to try and be vote winning and things like that. So it's a bit of
Yeah, exactly. And there were, again, we could do a whole session on the problems with SDLT and community-led housing. There's lots of reasons, lots of things that I think need to change. The other thing I would just mention is that there are big drawbacks to charitable status. I think some people get their views quite clouded because of the tax advantages and SDLT and all the rest of it. It does mean that everything you do has to be charitable, so it can be very restrictive. So it might mean that you can't do any non-charitable activities without setting up a separate organisation to do it. So it's not kind of, I get lots of groups who come to me and say we want to be charitable, and then when you kind of talk to them about what they're doing, either what they're doing doesn't qualify, or what they might want to do in 2 years' time isn't going to qualify. And it's worth kind of not jumping into it unless you're ready, because you can't undo charitable status. Once you've got charitable status, that's it, you're tied in. And the other thing I would just mention is, we've talked about the Charity Commission. The Charity Commission only regulates charitable companies. It doesn't regulate community benefit societies that have got charitable status. It's just a quirk in the legislation. It means you're exempt from Charity Commission regulation. You register, as a community benefit society, you register with FCA, and you register with HMRC as an exempt charity, but that's it. You don't have the commission.
So you're not actually a registered charity, but you're a charitable. You have charitable status. That's different. If you're actually a registered charity, then you are you're bound by the Charity Commission rules and the rest of it. You have to do all your trustees and what have you. But does that then, if you're a registered charity, does that then restrict you from grant funding?
No, that's a really good question. Charity law is basically the same. Although you're not registered with the Charity Commission, you're still subject to charity law. So you still have to have trustees, and your trustees have still got the same duties and so on. You're not a registered charity, and the main thing that means is that you don't have that number. You don't have the charitable number that the Commission gives you. And grant funders should understand that. They should. Most of the big grant funders should accept that you are an exempt charity, and they should understand that the likes of Esme Fairbairn, Nationwide Foundation, they deal with these organisations all the time. If you deal with a smaller grant funder, they might not know that this exists.
Charity, and you've got a charity number.
Yeah, but then it's a case of explaining to them that you are a charity. You're just not registered with the Commission because you're exempt in legislation.
So is there any benefit of actually becoming a registered charity or not?
You mean compared to a charity? The only benefit would be to get that number, and I don't think that's a good enough reason to choose to be a charitable company as opposed to a society.
I suppose there's a perception thing, isn't there? So people who might not understand the rules think, no, it's a registered charity, it's real, it's all kosher.
Yeah, but I mean there are requirements. There are legal requirements as to what you say on your letterhead and what you say on your website about what you are. And if you're a community benefit society, you would say we are an exempt charity registered with the FCA and with HMRC. Yeah, I've never seen it. The other thing to mention actually is the vast majority of housing associations are community benefit societies with charitable status. So most funders dealing with housing organisations know this structure. The difficult ones are banks. Banks don't always get this structure. But education, I think, is the key. Okay, so I'll just move on to this final wrapper. So we've done non-charitable asset locks, we've done charitable status. Finally, I just wanted to mention CLT status. When we went around the room before, it didn't sound like none of you were screaming CLT to me, apart from Brighton and Hove, obviously. But they've been through this.
In South Downs Eco.
Oh, in South Downs Eco?
Oh, yeah,
okay.
that's right.
Okay. And so a community land trust isn't a legal status. It isn't a legal structure, it's just a legal status. There's no national register of CLTs. There's no application form you fill in to become a CLT. All you have to do is meet the statutory definition. And the statutory definition is hidden away in a Housing Act. It's a horribly drafted piece of legislation, which says that you have to further the social, economic and environmental interests of a local community. Your membership has to be open to the local community, so that's this community-owned structure we keep talking about. Those members have to control the organisation, and you have to be non-profit distributing. I've summarised what the legislation actually says, but that's the essence of it. And I've also just put although there's no national register of CLTs, there is this national CLT network, and that, I think about half of CLTs at the moment in the country are members of the national CLT network. So just because you're a CLT doesn't mean you have to join the network, but it's quite a useful thing to know about because they've got lots of resources and they hold lots of events that you can go to, and so on. So CLT status is to be if you're a CLT, as we talked about right at the very beginning, you're holding assets, land and buildings for the benefit of the community in the long term, and you're acting as a steward of the land in the long term. And typically, there's lots of reasons for setting a CLT up, but some of the more common ones are where you see a need in your community for affordable housing, or if you come across the concept of dormitory villages. They began in this country, they began in rural areas where housing in rural areas became very unaffordable for local young people as they moved out. So then the villages were just left with old people and commuters, and during the week and during the day they were just deserted. So a CLT would be set up in somewhere like that to then build cheaper, affordable housing for the young people and bring them back. So it's that kind of quite altruistic motivation usually. Does anyone have any questions about that? Okay.
I can see some advantage of having a co-op on CLT land, but are there instances of the CLT interfering with the co-op?
There are that structure of a CLT with co-ops on the land is, I haven't seen that cause problems yet, but that's because it's not been used that much. Like the groups I'm dealing with who are looking at that are they're not quite there yet. So what we have seen, sorry, what I have seen is CLTs where there's been lots of problems with community division about what the CLT is going to do. So this kind of thing can be very emotive, can be very emotional, and I've seen situations where half of the board wants to do one thing and one or two rogue members of the board have gone off and flyered the neighbourhood saying this is what the CLT wants to do, isn't this awful, even though they're on the CLT board. So it's that, and this comes back to this idea of community engagement. So one of the things, again, this isn't a legal point, one of the things that I've seen from experience is that one of the most important things you can do as a CLT is community engagement. And a community share offer is quite a good way of getting that community engagement going. Yes. So the final thing, so we've looked at the basic structures, we've looked at those three wrappers, and then the final thing is looking at customising your constitution. So your constitution might be your articles if you're a company, or your rules if you're a society. And there are various ways that you can customise it to make it do what you want it to do. So it might be that you have various stakeholders represented within the governance of your organisation. So that could be the council, it could be residents, it could be a housing association or a developer or so on. You could also look at customising the voting rights that people have. So Brighton and Hove have got, I've been reminded today, they've got quite an interesting representative voting structure in there. Voting rights in co-housing contexts are often quite contentious. So to give you an example, you might have a co-housing group of 40 houses, and some of the houses have got one person living in, some of the houses have got 5 people living in. Now, if everyone who lived there had a single vote, it would mean that some of those houses get 5 votes, some get 1 vote. So I work with a couple of co-housing communities where what we've decided to do is distribute the votes among the actual houses. So each household gets 12 votes, and then it's up to them to divide them how they want. It depends on who goes to the meeting, actually. If all six of the people who live in that house go to the meeting, then they can have 2 each. It's totally horses for courses. It's whatever works for your own particular situation. Voting rights could also be key if you have external stakeholders. So the examples that I mentioned where councils have wanted to have involvement in the structure, sometimes the council has what I would call a golden vote, so a golden share, where they have a veto if, say, the organisation wants to borrow over a certain amount or wants to change its objects or change its legal structure or so on. And then finally, decision making. A couple of people mentioned sociocracy earlier. So we can write into a constitution different voting methods. I would usually say not to be too strict with that, and so the wording I tend to use is something along the lines of decisions will be made in whichever manner the board decides, because sociocracy isn't for everybody. It can work very well for some organisations, but it is quite sophisticated. Consensus decision making works well for lots of groups, but can be very slow and very slow. I think I know of one group where it took them 2 years to buy a tea tray because of consensus.
Radical Roots, we just went round with them for a year. I'm not advocating them at all, but I'm just saying they do consensus decision making -1. That's just what they do.
Yeah, so there's all sorts of different methods that you can use. So, and it's worth thinking if your community's got particular views and opinions on what decision making method you use. It's worth thinking about that when you're writing your constitution. So finally, I'm just going to run through three case studies, which I think is quite a helpful way of bringing some of this stuff to life. So Andrew mentioned Lancaster before. Chris Coates was one of the founder members of Lancaster. And if you've not been, I really urge you to go and visit. It sounded like a lot of you are thinking about resident-owned structures in particular. And Lancaster's a really good example of what I would call vanilla co-housing. There are more local examples, so Cannock Mill in Colchester is one that's almost there. They're hoping to move in later on this year. What they have there is a co-housing company, so it's just a straightforward, in terms of their basic legal structure. In fact, no, let's go back to the beginning. Their aims and priorities were to set up a co-housing community, build sustainable housing, where they could live community in an intentional community. Affordability wasn't really a concern for them at the time. I think they're more concerned about it now. So after they decided those aims and priorities, they could then look at, well, what basic structure should we be? Will be a company, because that gives them the power to be able to customise their articles. They can do quirky things around voting much more easily than you can with a society. They didn't need any of the extra wrappers. They weren't doing affordable housing. They weren't doing anything that met a charitable needs. They didn't need charitable status. It was financed by individuals putting equity in themselves and then going out and getting individual mortgages from the bank. So they got a development loan to actually do the build, but once it was all built, they granted long leases to individuals. And individuals who had enough cash to just buy their long lease hold outright could do, but the vast majority of people would have gone and got a conventional mortgage from a bank. So they didn't need any grant funding or anything like that. So there wasn't any need for an asset lock, and they weren't a CLT. It's a resident-owned structure, so they don't need to be a CLT. So it's actually quite straightforward somewhere like Lancaster. The co-housing company owns the freehold of the site, and there's obviously granted the long leases to the individuals, and it also owns the common house. So this is the common house, bottom right. This is big space in the centre of the street where they have communal meals once or twice a week. I think there's some people actually who eat there every night. It's a really lovely place to go to. So that's Lancaster. Oh, and the example that I gave you before, in terms of customising the constitution, the example I gave with the households and the voting rights being split up between households, that's them, that's how they do it. And actually it's changed over time. They had it so that it was just residents who could have a say over the organisation. A couple of years ago they started debating whether if someone moves out for a year and sublets their property, should that subtenant have the right to vote? And they're on the banks of the river and there's a rowing club that uses some of their facilities. Should people who use the rowing club have the right to vote? Because they have rights over the common areas, and how much say should they have over it? So they have these debates from time to time. The fact they've got a company which is quite a flexible structure means that it's not that difficult to change it. They don't have to go and get the FCA's permission to change things. They're not charities, they don't have to go to the Charity Commission or I don't have to think about any of those kind of issues. They can just sort of change it at will, really.
Can I ask a question slightly off the how in Brighton, if you were doing a development that size, you'd have a Section 106 agreement, you'd have to build 40% affordable housing. I mean, in theory, I know developers get around it. Do they not have to do that? Because
In Lancaster they didn't, and I don't know how they got around it.
fine.
I don't know. It's a debate.
It's another question. Yeah.
It is another question. Yeah.
Yeah, fine.
I was told they got around it by saying, well, we just can't do it.
Actually, right, and I think they had contaminated land, so didn't they make some argument about they cleared contaminated land and that was their contribution to the community? Because, but I mean, they literally cleared the contaminated land by getting overalls on and digging it out. It wasn't like sophisticated contamination; it was just digging out some crap, I think.
Yeah,
Okay.
and they
So maybe that's what they used as well.
they I think they inherited the site from someone else. I think someone else has got planning permission, if I'm right. So it could be that some of those arguments have been had before they got there.
Okay.
Maybe.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
So the second case study is my own CLT. I can talk about this one very easily. So in terms of looking at who our members were going to be, what our aims and priorities were, and where the money was going to come from, we are really, Otley is a small market town just in the north of Leeds. It's on the edge of the Yorkshire Dales, so it's quite a pricey place to be. Very beautiful. Again, it's on the river. A lot of these seem to involve riverside locations. And we came together and we did this visioning exercise where we all wrote down what our aims were and why we were involved. And we all realised that we wanted to build sustainable housing for local people to try and keep people in Otley, and that was affordable. It was more affordable than the housing that's currently on the market. In terms of the basic structure, we were pretty keen to engage we're still pretty keen to engage the wider community, and we also want to raise finance from the wider community. We want to do a community share offer. So in terms of the basic structure, it was pretty clear to us that we wanted to be a community-owned community benefit society. So community-owned because we had that outward-facing community vision, and community benefit society because we were pretty sure that we wanted to do a community share offer. And then in terms of extra wrappers, we've decided that we didn't want to be a charity because we didn't want to restrict ourselves. We're currently looking at doing a library of things, and we've looked at doing a bike repair shop and renewable energy project, which may not be a charitable project. So we thought we wouldn't restrict ourselves with charitable status, but we did want to have an asset lock. And one of the reasons we wanted the asset lock was partly because we're a community-owned structure, so we're doing something that we want to be for the benefit of the community in the long term. One of the other reasons is that we had some funding from the locality, and locality made us. So I think we would have had one anyway, but it was a case of, I wouldn't necessarily recommend being driven into something by your grant funder, but if someone's offering you quite a lot of support. National CLT Network also would usually require you to have an asset lock before they give you funding. And we're also hopeful that we'll be able to access community housing fund money with asset lock as well. And then in terms of customising our constitution, we've not had to do very much actually, because we don't have any sort of funny representation from stakeholders on the board. We've just drafted some objects that suit what we want to do. The other thing we've put in there is something which gives us a bit of flexibility about how decisions are made. So rather than just having majority decision making, we're looking at sociocracy actually. So we've done lots of work around different models. And then finally, this is the really quirky one, which I thought I'd mention. How many of you have heard of Lilac? Yeah, it's sort of a bit infamous. So they're based in Leeds. They are, at their heart, they're a housing cooperative. So in terms of going back to the three questions, people, property, pounds, people, they wanted to set up a co-housing community. Lilac stands for Low Impact Living Affordable Community. So they wanted it to be sustainable, low impact living, they wanted it to be affordable, and they wanted it to be community. So they wanted to have that co-housing element. They've got a common house and the common gardens and common allotments and so on. That led them to set up a resident-owned structure. So they knew they wanted to be a resident-owned structure. So they decided to become a housing cooperative. In terms of extra wrappers, the reason why they became a housing cooperative rather than a company was because they wanted to issue equity shares. And if you remember, companies limited by guarantee can't issue shares, so they had to be a cooperative society. There's other reasons why they would have chosen to be a cooperative society anyway. And this issuing of shares, and you all know about them, so you hopefully already know this, but in the standard cooperative model, you pay rent to the cooperative in return for the right to live there. In Lilac, you pay rent for the right to live there, but in return for living, as well as living there, you also accrue equity shares, and they do it linked on your income. So you pay a third of your income in each month, and in return for the money that you pay to the society, you get given equity shares. And it means that when you move out, you can cash in those shares and take the money with you.
And they peg the value of the shares in a slightly odd way to local incomes. So they've tried to protect it from what happens to the property market. So Andrea's final example about loan stock being linked to local property values, Lilac have done something similar but linking it to income rather than property. So it meant that in terms of basic structure, they wanted to be a resident-owned structure that could issue shares, so cooperative society was the obvious choice. Extra wrappers, they didn't need any. They didn't need the asset lock because it's this resident-owned structure. Charitable status they were never going to get because it's a resident-owned structure. And CLT status. Now, CLT status with them is a funny one because they use something called the mutual home ownership structure. The original mutual home ownership idea is built around a CLT. In Lilac's case, they don't need to be a CLT, so they didn't use that structure. You could potentially use MHOS, mutual home ownership, with a CLT, but it would need some careful thought, and I'm doing some work with a couple of organisations at the moment around that, which is very similar to what Andrew described, where you've got a CLT that owns the freehold, and then sitting on top of that you've got cooperatives, and those cooperatives could use this MHOS structure there. So it's a very sophisticated model. I think it's brilliant. I think it's got so much potential. It just needs simplifying. So I'm on a working party at the moment to try and simplify it. It's one of my projects for maternity leave. But I think it's a really they've called it affordable in Lilac, but the man who set it up, Paul Chatterton, he actually says he doesn't think it is affordable. It's intermediate because they can't do the cost of the build, and the cost of the land means they can't do it at rock bottom prices. But what they can do is offer it at less than it would cost on the open market.
So what did they, as individuals, did they all come in with equity, or was it a mix? Or
it was a mix. So to live there, the way they work it out is that there's a whole variety of properties. There's a shared house, and then there's 1-bed flats right up to 3-bed houses, possibly even 4-bed houses. And depending on what property you move into, there's a number of equity shares allocated to it. And you have to prove to Lilac that you can finance the cost of those equity shares. So you have to have a minimum income to live there. And you pay, when you move in, you pay a deposit, which I think is about 10% of the cost of the shares that are allocated to that bit of property. And then you just pay a third of your income each month. So there is people who had more equity could put in more at the beginning, which meant that Lilac as a cooperative society had to borrow less from the bank. Paul Chatterton has written a really good summary note, it's about 5 or 6 pages long, about how Lilac works, and he's also written a long book about it. I can send you the briefing paper if you've not already got it, because it's quite a good introduction to how this model works.
Where is it?
It's in Leeds. They do lots of learning days.
Just to mention, we're organising a learning day at Lilac on the 14th of July. Kim is organising it to go up together as a group from here. We booked their 14th of July learning day for Brighton CLT members.
Oh, brilliant. Good.
Yeah.
So, sorry, Amy, go on.
Have you ever heard of anyone doing like a similar thing but in an area with higher house prices and potentially a bigger gap between incomes?
Yeah, I've not heard of groups who've managed to get it off the ground yet, but certainly there are groups who are looking at it. There's a group in London, at least one group in London who are looking at it. And this is where it becomes not so much a question about legal structures, but definitely a financial model being the key.
So I suppose that doesn't work so well for where you might be looking at self-build to make you mortgage free, or you know that you're using it to bring down that cost, say, does it? Because they've come up with a structure where you continue to, but obviously that all depends on what you're bringing in and how much the land costs and the build costs and all the rest of it.
So that's a good point. So once you've bought all the equity shares that have been assigned to your property, you then stop paying a third of your rent, and then you just start paying a third of your income. You just start paying 10% of your income, because you've built up. They don't let people carry on buying equity shares, because I think on the basis that when you then moved out, you'd pull the rug from under the organisation, it would collapse. They'd have to refund you so much.
And the equity shares would increase, but they're linked to wages, not market value. So they'll probably not sell at anything like market value necessarily, will they? So
No.
They've kind of brought in a affordable element to it in a way.
Yeah, and I think that causes a bit of an interesting dilemma as to, if you've been there 20 years and then you move out,
how would you go back into the normal property market?
Because the wages have stagnated for years, haven't they?
Yeah.
So it's not unproblematic.
No, it's not, which is why I think it needs some. I think there are various groups looking at it at the moment, and I think removing that link to income is one way it could be simplified, perhaps.
Yeah.
But then that's such a brilliant part of it, so it's really tricky.
Yeah.
Okay, so the final slide I've got is just some quick top tips that we've got. We've been working with community-led housing groups for 30 odd years in our firm, and I just thought it'd be useful just to summarise some of the things I asked around my colleagues last time I did a presentation like this. I asked for what their most useful advice was based on their experience, and the first one, in fact most of these mirror exactly what Andrea said in her bits of advice. The first one is researching existing models. I have said think creatively, and definitely there is so much scope there for thinking outside the box and coming up with new ways of doing things. But your starting point, I think, should be to go and look at what's out there, because you don't want to have to reinvent the wheel every time. It's much quicker and cheaper in terms of drafting documents and modelling the finances and so on, if you can emulate an existing development. But the caveat I would add to that is don't just copy existing models, particularly existing models documents, because they're not always fit for purpose. So we've seen groups that have got into a real mess by going and borrowing another organisation's rules, articles, leases, and becoming really unstuck, and it's caused huge difficulties. So sort of use existing models but with care. Take advice. So at an early stage, tax advice is something which you should be thinking about taking. I'm not a tax expert, but there are extremely complicated rules around VAT, whether you're doing new build or refurb, whether you're a charity or a non-charity. You might have to pay VAT on some costs, but then not be able to recover them. And there are quite creative ways of structuring things, which might mean that you could recover some of the VAT that you pay on professional fees. I'll leave it there because I'm really not a tax person at all. I'm not a numbers person, but specialist tax advice is something we tell all groups to get at an early stage. Think like a developer. So developers are notoriously fairly ruthless, and community-led housing groups are not. But you're going up against them for some of these schemes. I mean, a lot of community-led housing groups end up acquiring bits of land that developers don't want, and that's why they're still available. But you have to negotiate and play hardball and be prepared for that, and it's sometimes a bit contrary to how you feel about what you're doing. Thinking creatively, certainly in terms of the structure that you're setting up, but also in terms of things like, if you're negotiating for a bit of land, we touched very briefly on this question about how you manage the cash flow. So if you've got equity built up in your property, at what stage do you sell that property? Sometimes with a landowner, you can work with them quite creatively so that they accept phased payments, or they accept a deal whereby you don't have to pay them until, we call it deferred consideration, you don't have to pay them until the development's got to a certain point, or until you've got planning permission, or until you're ready to move in. Like if you've got the right landowner, then you might be lucky and you might be able to strike some sort of deal like that so that you don't have to sell up and live on a sofa for the next 4 years while your development's being constructed.
But there's no loan, there's no banks or particular ethical mortgage do bridging loans in these situations, and there's no specialist financial.
It's worth talking to some. So there are certain lenders in this sector who would understand what you're talking about. So Ecology, in particular, Triodos, Charity Bank, they all do community-led housing schemes fairly frequently. So it's worth having a conversation with them and seeing. In terms of expectation management, I think you will all know this, but it takes a long time, and it's making, not only remembering that yourself, but also when you get new members along, sort of making it clear to them that you're not about to move in somewhere next week, and the houses are going to be £100,000 each for a 4-bed. Resilience is sort of the same point really, that you have to kind of keep going. So the best groups, you'll all know the Old Women's Housing Cooperative in London. It's taken 20 years to get off the ground, but they've moved in. It's brilliant. And the same, Lilac took 7 years, and I think it probably almost broke. The person set it up, and Chris Coates has been plugging away at this for a long time before Lancaster Care hasn't got off the ground. So it's kind of keeping going really. And then finally networking. So again, this comes back to this point of learning from each other. So in Yorkshire in particular, we have a network of groups, and we're trying to formalise ourselves a little bit because we think we've got a lot to learn from each other. One of the key drivers of that actually is what Andrew just mentioned about Section 106 agreements and how you can negotiate with the council so that you don't have to provide 40% affordable housing, because that could really hamper your financial model. But I think you've already got that here. You've got that network here through Brighton and Hove CLT, so it's great really to see. So that's it. If you've got any questions, we've got another 17 minutes before we have to be out of the room.
Yeah.
I'm willing to answer questions.
Is there anything about the enterprise investment scheme, seed investment? Because it's obviously you've got this the investors can gain tax relief, so the money's cheaper. And have you ever heard of any community-led housing groups taking advantage of that on behalf of the investors, or investors taking advantage of it on behalf of the
So there are a number of tax relief schemes out there which give investors income tax relief on the money that they put into an organisation. Enterprise investment relief is one of them, but it has to be an enterprise, and community-led housing wouldn't be an enterprise. The one which I think has the most potential is something called social investment tax relief, but it's not possible to do that for community-led housing either. We thought that was a goer,
Right.
It's not.
So why? Sorry, if it's not an enterprise. It is an enterprise, isn't it?
But it's not trading.
They have a defined or specific definition of what an enterprise is.
But it's not trading.
That leads me on to my second question, which is one of the things we're hoping to do is have the housing group as a trading organisation, or carrying out certain trading activities, such as providing some of the services like personal assistant services and education and stuff like that for other people, and also services to others as well, not just the members, for discounted rates, because it's to make it more affordable, like getting repairs done and education and stuff as well. So in that context, isn't that an enterprise, and can that sort of enterprise be a sort of charitable community housing group?
I think there's a couple of questions in that. I think the question about whether what you're doing means that you're then a trading organisation, and most of the tax relief, again, I'm not a tax lawyer, so it's only very general advice, but you can only do a certain amount of non-trading activity. So you'd have to look at whether the majority of what your organisation did was trading. If the majority of what your organisation did was providing housing, and trading's a tiny part of it, you're probably not a trading organisation.
So in terms of the seed investment or the social investment, you possibly wouldn't qualify for it.
Yeah, there is another one, CITR, community. I can't remember what it stands for. Community something, which I believe might have more scope. But again, it's probably worth taking specialist advice on that one.
Neil, I'm just going to offer the floor to other people because we haven't got long, and I know you've got really specific questions. Can I suggest other people got any questions? Sorry, Neil.
I got really excited about Lilac's mutual home ownership scheme. But when our group looked at it, we found it would be a real disincentive to people who own their houses now, and would lose money over time because their equity would rise with local wages rather than house prices. So we've moved to another model now, but I still got an attachment to this, and I feel the answer's in there somewhere. I'd be really interested to know what ideas are emerging to modify mutual home ownership.
I mean, that is the $1 million question, and this is where my baby's due in August, so I'm hoping that the answer's going to emerge between August and subsequent March or something. I think there's a few ideas that are worth exploring. One is removing this link between the increase in value of your shares and wages and letting it rise in line with property values. The tricky bit around this, and I've never quite got my head around it in Lilac's case, is that shares in a co-op or shares in a community benefit society don't rise in value. They're not like a normal share, a company share, that they stay at the nominal value of £1. So I think we'd have to think carefully about how the way that they deal with it in their rules is a bit, last time I looked at it was a bit grey, but maybe I need to revisit it. But I think there's I think that's probably one of the key ones.
Do they not even rise with the rate of inflation?
It's one of the reasons why you're exempt from all the financial promotions legislation, because it's not like a normal share. It's not this big risky thing. It's more like a debt, really.
Can you, to say the council finds some land for 5-6 houses and you pay a lease on the land, so you're paying rent for the land, you can still build a private property on there. Is that the same, or would you only be able to build a property on there that would be kind of also a lease agreement?
Describe that again.
So if you, rather than buying a piece of land, so say if you weren't looking to find a piece of land you could afford to buy, but say the council found a bit of land, they said, well, we'll lease it to you, like Bunker, but like Bunker's housing, they're doing it on this thing, aren't they, with their zero equity, and but if you did have equity, can you build an actual physical home that you own, that you've paid to build on leased land? And if so, what kind of market value does it have? Or that's my.
I suppose what you'd be looking at is what gives you the right to build that property on that bit of land. So chances are you would then have a lease personally from the council, and what you could do with that bit of land would then be determined by the terms of that lease. So in Bunker's case, it's a housing co-op, and the lease that it's got from the council, right? That lease will say what it can do on that land. So it's that really.
I suppose I'm just thinking, as a mixed group, does the fact that there is some equity mean we can only build on land that we physically buy, or do we have more options in that?
No, you could, and you'd have to persuade the council that you were worthy over and above other groups, that you were giving them something that the council wanted, and that's Bunker are a pilot.
Yeah.
And how Bunker are selling it to the council is because it will be affordable housing, and originally they were all on the housing register. So that was even really tied in.
Nobody else wanted to touch it, did they? That bit of land for it.
Yeah, that's sort of the case. So that was a little bit of a fudge. But they've only got a 99-year lease, so the houses have to be, in theory, what happens is the council get the land back in 99 years, and the housing, isn't there at the end of it. So it really is about, in that sense, in legal terms, it's a temporary thing.
This question, I think you've come back to it a couple of times, and I think probably it applies to a lot of people in the room, about where you've got a mixed group and you've got some people with lots of equity, lots of money to put in, lots of capital. Equity is a word that uses lots of different things, means lots of different things, so let's use the word capital. And then you've got other people who've got nothing to contribute. So that's Otley CLT is exactly the same, and I think a lot of co-housing schemes are going to be exactly the same. And I wouldn't get too hung up about that really in terms of that dictating your legal structure. The main thing that affects is your financial model. So if you've got lots of people who can put money in, it means that you have to borrow less from the bank. Your community-led housing organisation borrows less from the bank to do the build. There are decisions that you would need to make as a group about what your property structure looks like once it's built, and if you've got someone who has got an awful lot of money to put in and then someone else who's got nothing to put in, something like Lancaster would be quite tricky to do, because that relies on the individuals having money to buy their long lease at the end. And I mean, Lancaster's got a couple of properties for sale at the moment which are on for £350,000 house to have to force a sale.
And with that sale, you couldn't just sell, as a cooperative model, you couldn't just sell that one house to just solve the problem, so long as the co-op agreed the new person to return.
So you potentially could, you could carry on.
But it depends, I suppose, on whether that would, because that could be really attractive to a buyer, that it's in that kind of, or it could really put somebody off. So it just makes you a bit more specialist in terms of sale, doesn't it?
Yeah, and there are all sorts of, as Andrew said, there's all sorts of weird and wonderful models. I came across an organisation recently where you have to buy in with cash. It's been going since the 1890s, I think. You have to buy in with cash, and you don't get any property deeds. They burned the property deeds in the 1890s because they didn't believe in private property ownership.
So, I mean, it's the wackiest one I've come across. And if someone came to me and said, should I buy this? I was like,
I mean, ultimately the question also, I think it's good to talk explicitly, not enough groups do it, is like, who is willing to forgo their property gain? I mean, are people willing to forgo an element of their property gain? And one of the things we talked about, because I'm interested in kind of people doing it in later life, is like, well, you know, yes, the first question is inheritance, so people always frame it that way, but that's a kind of personal, it's about when you can give up your personal, family, children's gain to contribute to a community that will then give you something else. And that's the way we talked about it in the group I'm in, is, you know, that's Peter.
Yeah, I wanted to say something about that earlier when Julian was saying about the lilac model and it going, the value going up with income and how that wasn't satisfying members who wanted to go up. I mean, in a way, there is just quite an important decision to make about whether we're not prepared to kind of cut out of this totally unjust system and forego some personal benefit in order to contribute to a more just system. So, I mean, you know, that there isn't actually an easy answer to it because it's actually a moral choice or political choice.
And the key thing is about that being trapped, if you know. But I think when you're in a later stage of life, maybe the being trapped-ing isn't quite such a thing as it is for a younger family, feeling like they might want to live in this community forever, and if they've lived in it for 20 years with their kids, then how do they get out if they want to get out of it? There is that getting out. It's a really tricky dilemma, but in the end you do have to weigh up. Do you want to live differently? And therefore you have to forgo something, or do you want to just follow the mainstream model, in which case you might as well be living in a street. You know, just buy in a street, buy in a cul-de-sac, you know, buy one of the properties in a cul-de-sac and make it a common house, you know. In the end, that's the real decision, not so much the legal form, but like you say, Peter, it's a kind of moral decision about, and a redistributive decision, personally and collectively, isn't it?
When you say gain, you mean increase in value?
Yeah, the increase in, yeah. And bear in mind that we're exploring as a CLT a model whereby that scheme we talked about, a fundamental CLT with a series of community-led housing projects on top, is where the people who invest in it get a gain that is more than you would get in the bank, which is currently what, 0.5% or something, I don't know. So you might get 1 or 1.5%, nothing like property gain, but you get a better return, and that's a sort of more mediated. So they're getting a return. The people in there are able to borrow that much cheaper money at 1% or 1.5%, and that makes the scheme more affordable. But what that person isn't getting with their lump of money is property gain. Well, property can go down.
Well, yeah, it's not
guaranteed. You know, it's bound to crash. Sooner or later, this local housing economy is bound to crash. It's completely unsustainable. So if you're getting 1.5%, and the property market has crashed, you're doing all right, actually. You know, it's a safer bet in some ways if you're promised that.
That's a good counter-argument, yeah, because we're having that internal argument about several of our members have more equity than others. They're sort of reluctant, although not completely refusing to let go of the increase in prices, and that's a good counter-argument. Yeah, yes, the property market is volatile, and you can lose out big just as you can win big.
Yeah. And if you've got a standard family mortgage, you're paying £1,000 a month to a bank in interest.
Yes.
You're not even paying that. That's not paying off. So over a year, you might pay 10 grand in interest to a bank. Yeah. And also, if you've got a much smaller mortgage, or you're even possibly able to wipe it, you're possibly saving another on top of that. You know, so there is the argument you can actually be more helpful to your kids when they actually need it, which is when they're 20s and 30s, really, or you know, potentially later, rather than when they're 50 and it's not such a big help, you know. So
And that model that I described, where you might have a co-op that buys a property and individuals who've got equity to put in lends the cooperative the money. What we have done in that situation, where we've had people who have not wanted to risk their capital, they might be selling a big house, they might be really worried about the fact that this big house is going up in value, they don't want to lose that gain. We can write something into the loan agreement that links any increase in local property values. So you've still got that. For the people who are nervous, you've still got it. They could always forego it. You know, if it came to it, they could always say, well, we don't want it. So it kind of acts as a bit of a carrot for them if they need it.
I'm going to suggest we finish just because it's 5-2. Do you want to squeeze your last question in, Julian?
It's just that with the government's leasehold reform on the horizon, can we really consider leasehold models?
For now, yeah. And I think it seems unlikely, I mean, who knows, but it seems unlikely that they'll get rid of leaseholds that currently exist. But if they stop allowing you, I mean, you wouldn't want to go down the route of paying to have a long lease drawn up and then you not be able to issue it because the government changes the law. Hopefully, I think the big hope is that community-led housing will become exempt from those rules.
Why can't you sort of do a share freehold sort of model?
So there are some that do that. That K1 in Cambridge, it's not a client of ours, but K1 in Cambridge is a co-housing model which is quite similar to Lancaster, but instead of granting long leases to residents, they have granted them the freehold. So it ends up being that you've got this carved up freehold. And the difficulty with it is that it means that instead of writing in all the obligations of living in that community into the lease, you have to put it as covenants on the freehold title, and it's much harder to enforce. So so like traditionally at Lancaster, if you want to sell, your lease has lots of provisions around what happens when you sell, and you have to sell to somebody who's approved by the co-housing company. I think you've got 6 months or something for them to approve it, and then you can sell to anybody. It's much harder to do that with a freehold model. So, and actually in K1 they don't have any sort of approval mechanism. They decide it's self-selecting. So if you want to move into a community like this, you can do. So it's certainly possible, but probably not ideal. So I'm around. I'm working till August. So feel free to email me with questions. After August, there's a whole team of us. So you'll find all. If you go to the Wrigley's website, you'll see details of the community housing team on there. Or if you email my email address, it'll get forwarded to somebody, I'm sure.
Are there many solicitors who specialise in this area?
No, it's not a very big area. I've really backed myself into a corner with specialisms.
Surely it's going to get bigger, though, surely.
I used to work with housing associations, which is why I've sort of moved into this. But there's us and there's another firm called Anthony Collins who do quite a lot of work in this area, and there are others who dabble, but we're the main two really.
So I just want to thank Laura for her Leeds and for her